partners, Lighthouse and Yeehaw, I would like to welcome all of you to this virtual North Belfast Health Summit. Throughout the summit, we will explore key themes which impact on the health of local communities, as well as giving participants the opportunity to learn more about some of the projects taking place across North Belfast. This event is part of the executive-sponsored Communities in Transition, or CIT project, which involves communities from 8 different geographic areas, supporting ambitious initiatives that will build the capacity of individuals and groups to effect positive change for themselves and their communities. In North Belfast, the CIT areas are Ardoyne and New Lodge. Over recent years, community activists working alongside statutory agencies and government departments have worked hard to bring positive change, cascading tools to enable resilience at local level. As close-knit communities with a strong identity, shaped by a shared experience of division within the city, the communities have, over the last year, taken time to re-envisage their sense of place and how that sits within the future of the vision for the city of Belfast. From appreciating the amazing built heritage of North Belfast to reconnecting to the River Lagan, local people are thinking about and living differently in this great part of the city. From the garden grid to the network of allotments that have become a place of sanctuary, renewal and sustenance over the last year, a time of such profound change for all of us. As unpredictable and unwelcome as COVID-19 is, it has served to remind us of the importance of health and well-being and the value of place. It has also allowed local communities to think about community safety in a world of uncertainty, and the skills and resources that people, families and communities need to flourish beyond the limitations of negative experiences and structural inequalities. At a time when good mental health has never been more important, the Health and Wellbeing Programme within the Communities in Transition Programme has placed psychologists at the heart of the community, working with people as they reframe their thinking, change behaviours, and ultimately change their lives. Central to the change are the young people in Ardoyne and New Lodge. How they think and talk about themselves, their families, their friends, and their neighbours. Their plans and aspirations to the future are crucial to how we as a community think, talk, and plan for the future. I would like to pay tribute to the 84 champions and befrienders recruited as part of the overall programme. 31 champions and 53 befrienders who have contributed massively throughout this pandemic, when communities have shown great determination, support, and leadership at grassroots level. That's all I have to say, except to introduce the First and Deputy First Ministers who have kindly agreed to say a few words about the Communities in Transition Programme and the importance of the Health Summit in promoting and supporting positive change in local communities. Once we have heard from the ministers, we will then hand over to the panel chairperson, who will introduce the panel and commence the session. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. As First Minister, I am delighted to welcome you all to this Health Summit, which is part of the Communities in Transition Programme for North Belfast. It is disappointing that we cannot be with you in person to listen and contribute to this very important issue, but we are grateful that through the medium of technology, we can continue to have opportunities to engage with projects like yours. In this challenging period, the Communities in Transition Programme is a particularly timely intervention. The initiative is a significant community-facing element of the Executive Action Plan on tackling paramilitarism, criminality, and organised crime. It seeks to support communities and build capacity in areas which have been the most deeply affected by criminality and coercive control. And as part of the CIT programme, Ashton Community Trust has been delivering a health and wellbeing project. It is addressing underlying community and personal issues around mental health and wellbeing. Alongside this project, Ashton are also delivering interventions focusing on community safety, capacity building, and urban regeneration. This is very much a collective effort. It includes government, community groups, voluntary organisations, and individuals. The success of initiatives such as this depends on collaboration, and I applaud all those involved for their contribution. Thank you to Irene for the very kind invitation to speak with you today, And I wish you every success to the Health Summit, and I hope that you all find value from today's event.
Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be part of the North Belfast Health Summit. Looking after our own health and well-being and that of others has never been more important. And there are many fantastic community initiatives helping to improve the health and well-being in North Belfast and beyond. As part of the Executive's Action Plan on tackling paramilitarism, criminality and organised crime, our Communities in Transition programme is supporting a range of important interventions in North Belfast. The 4 projects delivered by the Ashton Community Trust are aimed at building capacity and resilience within the New Lodge and Ardoyne. These priority themes were highlighted by the community through the co-design process, and we are committed to ensuring that the voices of local people continue to be heard throughout the delivery of the projects. This summit will support the development of a more strategic and impactful approach. It will help to address key issues impacting on the most vulnerable within our society and narrow the ground for those who would seek to hinder neighbourhoods from enjoying the benefits of peace. Community-based and community-informed interventions are vital in tackling issues around paramilitarism, criminality and coercive control. And we in the Executive remain committed to supporting this vital work. I want to commend Ashton Community Trust and its community partners for delivering this very worthwhile event and for all the interventions under the Communities in Transition programme to date. Thanks to you all.
Hello, my name is Mark Hackett. I'm an architect based in Belfast. And today we're going to look at reconnecting North Belfast to the river as a general theme. We've kind of got a diverse panel here today of architects, local activists and community development, and also people coming from a public health perspective. And I'll start the slideshow now, and we'll get into a presentation for around 20 minutes. And that will give you an oversight into the history of the area, but also the kind of current issues that are going on. And then solutions that have been evolved in the last number of years to kind of deal with an intractable problem of the disconnection of North Belfast from the river of the Lagan and the city itself, the city centre. So this is an old picture of Sailortown. This area was towards the docks and the river was known as Sailortown in the past. And it's just an image of what it was like in those parts of Belfast. Today, it's like this. It's had a number of motorways driven through from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s in various phases. And it's under threat of another kind of final connection called an interchange that joins these motorways. You can see a lot of derelict land there, but I draw your attention to these 3 streets that used to exist: York Street, Belson Street, Corporation Street, and also the blue area, some fine buildings that exist at the Harbour Masters and Sinclair Siemens Church. And in the orange dot, we'll be talking about this church, which is part of Sailortown, St. Joseph's. And you can see there in these slides, the Sailortown was a very diverse area, people living beside showrooms and commerce. It was the most, in a way, diverse and lively area of Belfast. It connected seamlessly with the docks and the city centre and had communities within it. This is York Street, once a really fine street leading out of the city centre, but that is almost all gone at the moment. Things that remain are down at the docks. You can see the yellow cranes of Harland and Wolff, the area where the Titanic was built. You can see new development at the Titanic Quarter. And in the foreground, you can see the oldest shipbuilding docks in the city at Clarendon Quay. And then just beside that is this beautiful church by Sir Charles Lanyon, called Sinclair Siemens, and the Harbour Master's office. So 2 listed buildings that remain in the middle of all these roads. So the area used to look like this. It was a grid of streets that connected from North Belfast on the left down through streets to the river frontage, and then a series of streets going diagonally northwards up the page. And you can see a York Street station at the top there, a terminus, a sort of beautiful train station that was knocked down in 1973. And at the very bottom of the map, at this point, you've got the cathedral and the city centre of Belfast as it is now. You've got the Lagan, and actually just under my pictures is where the Titanic was built. for people coming. I'd like to welcome you from lots of different countries, by the way. Belfast pre-conflict was a city that was very connected. It had grown organically. An area we're looking at is highlighted here. What happened in the 60s was there was a planned series of motorways, but they weren't actually implemented until the 70s, 80s, and 90s. And they were never actually brought together and finished. So the interchange that connects these motorways has always been a kind of temporary connection, and which has been going on for 10 years. And that has provided a kind of problem for the area in the sense that there's a vacuum. There's a vacuum of decision making. There's an uncertain future. People are concerned about the road design junction, which has been proposed for the last 10 years, because they realize it's going to create a barrier in the city that will probably never be overcome. But the project is changing in a way because it has taken a long time to implement. We've had climate change rising up the agenda in the world. We now have COVID. And I think it's time to question what we talk about for this part of the city. So it's been highlighted there at the top of the map. But to give you a general overview of Belfast, Belfast is a city where now, after road building and a number of years of conflict, you have a fairly intact city core shown in yellow in the middle. It's had a lot of ragged edges and buildings rebuilt, but it's generally intact. But the problem is it's surrounded by these ring roads and motorways and flat car parks. And this creates what we call a kind of shatter zone all around. The communities where people live are shown in buff areas, and we call this the grey donut because it surrounds almost the entire city centre. And Belfast is then characterised as a town which its regeneration in the last 20 years has been car-bound based. So a lot of people driving in to the successful city centre, but a lot of communities surrounding that city centre who've not really enjoyed the full regeneration are kind of trapped in a sense by these roads. And that's reflected in the area of deprivation map for the city. So the darker areas are the poorer areas or the higher deprivation areas. So like many cities, Belfast is what Brenton Murtaugh called a twin speed city. It's running at twin speeds. It's got success and it's got jobs and parts of the city that work well, but it also has a lot of dysfunction. And the spaces between those are largely often defined by roads as well. This is a series of maps that look just at street networks. And again, you can see the area in the top and middle is the area we're looking at today in North Belfast. In 1860, it was a completely connected city of side streets where people lived, main avenues. And after 30 or 40 years of change, you notice that the motorway system has been put in very close to the city centre. It's a very small city in a way. But also, if you look at this map as I flick backwards and forward, you'll see the whole rehousing areas were built in cul-de-sac form. So the level of disconnection and separation is quite profound all around the city centre. And this again, you see that grid of streets at Sailortown in the middle of the picture largely disappeared by the time we come to 1990. So that's it pre-60s and in 1990. This is called a figure ground map where black represents building and white space you can then perceive as streets and squares. And here you see there's no sense of order at all and the motorway put in. So these motorways act as a kind of non-pedestrian space. You simply can't be within these spaces as a pedestrian. They're like moats or sunken areas or they're embankments. And the areas between them that you can walk through are pretty uncomfortable and unsafe spaces. So this is an issue for public health of these neighborhoods as well, because they can't actually traverse this territory and they don't feel comfortable or safe doing it. And that means that the communities in the top left of the picture here are kind of isolated from the growth of the city. In purple there, you've got a new university campus coming into the city finishing this year. So it's a big regeneration plus. But the danger is that doesn't manage to connect into the communities nearby who most need it. So these are the developments that are going on. We've got the historic Cathedral Quarter in Belfast. It's a very successful area. The new campus, Harbour Regeneration is building offices, as is Titanic Quarter, which is diverse film industry, education there. And you have a series of historic neighbourhoods from Shankill, New Lodge, Tigers Bay, York Road, who are all, in a sense, the poor areas of the city that suffered multiple problems through the last 6 decades and are separated from that. And this is the current York Street Interchange project. Its aim is to connect these 3 motorways finally in a seamless manner. But the problem is, in doing that, it connects the roads, but it doesn't connect the city. It probably finally embeds the separation of the city and the disconnection of North Belfast forever from the river. It's a very damaging project in the sense that it takes 3 to 4 years to build and has 13 temporary phases. We have looked over the last 5 years. There is an alternative solution to the road problem to let the roads flow, but actually to allow us to rebuild the city around the roads then. It doesn't involve any underground works. It's much more simple to build, and it's actually massively cheaper. So I'm going to talk a little bit through that. To put a picture on that, that's what it looks like today. You've got residents quite close to all this road building. And you've got the North City Centre at the bottom of the picture, which is regenerating the new university, and various things are happening. This is the project for the road that's been sort of dusted off in the last 10 years and has faced a number of challenges to its implementation. It's quite an expensive scheme. It's a very difficult scheme to realise, but it does connect the motorways in a kind of spaghetti junction, as people would call it. And the problem for residents in North Belfast is that this project doesn't really deliver pedestrian connectivity and cycling connectivity in a safe and high quality manner. And it doesn't generate regeneration in that either. There's 13 very complicated phases to implementing this project because you have to move a lot of underground services. You've tunnels and underground spaces to build. That's one of the diagrams of those 13 phases. So it's a complex project. And the solution for the alternative gives a lot of the benefits for road users of the current interchange, but creates much less damage and is a much smaller scale of construction. So we're advocating that this is the better solution for the 21st century. But to give people a flavour of what it is there's your 3 motorways coming in, city centre at the bottom. And the new proposal is to build a high level bridge, which then descends in this deep curve in orange, down 5 metres under sea level, 8 metres below ground. And that's because the purple route has to cross over it. And then finally at high level is the bridge that you can see sweeping down to the bottom of the picture. So this is the kind of fundamental solution and problem is connecting these motorways at this point. The next stage of that is that this street called York Street in blue has to be built as a very large table over the top of those roads which are sunken. And at this point, the roads cross. So you've got a high level road, a level road with ground, and then you've got a very deep road. So you've got 3 motorways essentially having to connect. You're very close to tidal waters and you're 5 metres below sea level at that point. So the alternative effectively takes that purple road and takes it through an existing bridge in a separate lane. It lets it flow in the direction it wants to go to the bottom of the screen. And it also solves, instead of doing this new sweeping road, it uses the existing road, but puts a new curve on and lets it flow through to the left-hand side. And then we build more agile bridges that are more pedestrian friendly at York Street. And just to show that again in a 3-dimensional view, that's the current view. Because this traffic passes through, you get a series of traffic lights. And we've lived with this for 40 years, a temporary solution. So there's a lot of traffic lights, all the regional traffic in the area and in the region is coming through this junction. So it is a massive problem for the city that needs solved. The current solution is to build this new bridge and cutting through the pumping station, and then the big table that's needed at York Street, which is 5 metres into the air. And the evening traffic still has to go through 2 sets of traffic lights. So we're worried that that's still going to block up in the evening with traffic. And this is the alternative solution to take this road in magenta, bring it round the existing bridge, weed it in through that existing structure, very sort of, solution that is possible to separate that road. And then to install new bridges across and reconnect York Street to allow the traffic to flow seamlessly onto the motorway in the evening rush hour. And then finally to realign the road in orange and put a new curve in. And at red, we would sort of say that you could gather the pedestrians and cyclists onto this. This is a bridge in Seoul that was converted a few years ago, reuses a 70s infrastructure. But it's like New York, the High Line. It's a kind of park-like connection that could be installed at that part of the design. And then finally, that allows a lot more redevelopment. Because this scheme takes up much less land, it allows the land around to kind of hem in the road, hide it, contain it. So the master plan that we're proposing, in a sense, it's not a fixed plan, but it's the idea that all the purple areas there are new building blocks. Most of that is in public ownership and can be developed in a different model. Some of it is private, but isn't happening because the road issue is holding back development in this area. But you can see a network of streets that we can recreate and restitch. It's not a romantic notion of trying to recreate a city past. It's the idea of just building connection that is full of activity, people living, good street quality, pavements, cycling, and a different priority. And we need this project to be an infrastructure for everybody. It can't just be for the car. It starts to stitch together the major redevelopments that are going on between the university and the docks. And here we see the sort of housing that could be delivered within that. On the left, you see some housing from Malmo, which is working on a kind of 21st century idea of how do we build housing with good quality environment. And on the right, we see a good example from London from a number of decades ago, where Coin Street community builders managed to build courtyard housing in the center of London with a kind of beautiful environment, but also in a cooperative manner where they manage the space. So could we rebuild Corporation Street in some manner like this, where we build a whole series of medium scale developments with a garden behind and reclaim some of these old street names that existed? And at Nelson Street, which is currently a very heavily trafficked area, we could still make a busy street. But the traffic on the left is that orange route that I showed. That's the motorway traffic coming from the M2 north. Can be hidden behind a sound barrier and landscaped. And then the city streets are returned to still quite a busy aspect on this side, but buildings used as essentially a barrier. On a York Street, one of the major streets in the city leading north, you can then put that wide pedestrian and cycle path in. You can allow relatively narrow roads to be streamed and contained in their scale, and good landscaping infrastructure. And all the motorways flow below that and separated and screened from the city. So this is that idea essentially of, in the center, creating a new urban village outlined in black. Those old street names in green are fragments that maybe could be reclaimed in some sense. But the major two connections would be from Duncairn, as we know it in the city, through to the river, and a new bridge created across the Titanic Water, and another connection at Great George Street, which suddenly becomes a quiet street, connecting through those beautiful buildings at the Harbour Masters and through to another bridge. And at the bottom of the screen, we have the potential for our inner ring road to be turned into a proper boulevard with the university and students at that end. And then crossing that, we're trying to create new streets, York Street, Nelson Street, which can be kept open in the alternative option. And then Corporation Street, the once fine street that Corporation Street was, and a green route through that housing, so that the housing also defines a large public park and green routes through the city. So that's a way of delving into that sort of sketch master plan that we've sort of looked at. The purple or magenta sites are publicly owned, so those could be developed in a different way. And then going down into the south and the new university at the bottom left, and the connections to the river. This is a good example, I think, from Paris, where you've got an underpass that can be designed up against landscape and people in a clever and well-designed way. And I think the whole approach would be to try and eke out design as best we can and bring design to the fore. And this is a sketch. I might even just pull out of the show and zoom in to that, So there's your motorway, there's your potential new neighborhood, a new train station that we need to build at this location, so that we try to drive through these difficult spaces, well lit, new development, better designed streets and infrastructure. So even though it's difficult territory, we can connect across to the river. We'll have Terry talking about, Terry is looking at saving this little church called St. Joseph's that we've shown. And Terry's a great advocate of trying to build this bridge to Titanic Water, which we really need to get on the city agenda. And there's a long-term plan that hasn't been realized for a bridge here. So that's showing, this is where the Titanic was built. This is the Titanic Experience Building, which is a very popular location. These are the two famous cranes in Belfast, Samson and Goliath, which were installed in the 60s, but are a landmark on the city. And you've got Titanic Water here. So that's an image that's trying to project how communities in this area can be connected down to a new vibrant city junction into the university, how this new neighborhood can be built. There's a little church, the Harbour Masters. So there's ways of building buildings against roads, I suppose, is our proposition here. And going back to this slide, It's very much about the values we want to bring. Could we do this in a land trust where more non-profit and cooperative initiatives are given some scope to happen, but we could have a low carbon future. An inherent flood barrier for the city could be created. Good urban design and placemaking over a long period of time is needed. We need somebody to curate this. It's not going to happen, I believe, with the free market and development left unfettered. And how do we create living streets is a big challenge, I think, in every city. How do we make streets really work? We can't depend, of course, on shopping for everything. On commerce, we have to make living streets where people live on them. People and connections, green space, links, cooperatives and social value, and then reconnecting to the river. So that is the proposition that we're trying to bring forward and discuss today. And I'd now like to, start to bring in our panel. We've got Terry McKeown, who works in Sealertown Regeneration. Terry's working at trying to save that church at St. Joseph's, but also she's working with the community, a small community that exists down there that's quite disconnected, but she's working very hard to connect them into various things, like she'll talk about a maritime mile and so on. We've got Professor Michael McGarry, who is from Queen's University and has been teaching in the city for around 10 years. So Michael McGarry is has a number of his students are actually involved in a number of tutors like Augustina, who have brought students down. The University of Ulster also have students looking at this area. So I think there's quite a lot of the students looking in today who've been looking at this over the last number of years and working with Terry, for instance. We've got Mary Black, CBE. So Mary is a health professional with 40 years experience, and she's a independent facilitator for Healthy North Belfast. That's an initiative set up to kind of talk about how can we get a healthy city. And today's theme is then thinking about how architects and planners can connect into that. How can we talk about a healthy city? I was musing to Mary that that when you think about the 19th century and the 20th century, engineering and putting in sewers and roads and avenues of trees was a 19th century concern of engineering was driven out of public health, was driven out of cholera epidemics and dealing with public health. And then in the 20th century, architects and planners came together coherently in the 30s and in the 50s post-war to rebuild cities and to deliver housing, schools. And I think architects and planners at that time had more clarity about what they were doing. And it definitely was coming from a public health kind of perspective. So we've seen those issues joined together at that time. And I think maybe the interesting thing in this discussion would be how we all start to think back how built environment, architects, planners, public health officials, and our city leaders try to think in a more coherent way. So we're also really glad to invite and welcome Tony Fretton from London. I met Tony over in Edinburgh a number of years ago, and we were talking about our work together at a forum. So I'm glad that Tony can make it. Many of the architects will, of course, know Tony's work in London over a number of years, but Tony's practice has also built in the Netherlands and elsewhere in Europe, including Denmark. I think, Tony, you've got one of your galleries built there, but you've built a number of housing and mixed development schemes in large frameworks, and I think you might want to talk about that later. And then finally, Dr. Ken Sterrett. Many people in the city will know Ken from Queen's Planning. Ken, I've worked with in the past, and Ken's a great advocate for communities and connectivity and, the value of planning and thinking forward in the city. So I thought we'd maybe introduce Terry first, being the kind of local, and Terry also works as one of the health advisory boards and lives in North Belfast, like myself. So Terry, we've worked together for a number of years, and I'd like to welcome you here today.
Hi, Mark. Yeah, sorry, I can't see myself at the minute, so
I'll stop screen.
Yeah, okay. Oh, yeah, all right. Yeah, so so I work with Sealertown Regeneration, which you were looking at in your maps there. So Sealertown was the docks area of Belfast for people who don't really know Belfast. It was a thriving hub of industry. People down here were dockers, worked in the local industries. A lot of them went to sea. So Sealertown was kind of the transition point between the rest of the world and Belfast. So there were about 5,000 people living here. But then when the motorway was built in the beginning of the late 60s, early 70s, all those houses with 5,000 people living in it were were demolished. Now, the people at the time were told that they would have to move out to get the motorway built, but that they would be rehoused in some form down here. But unfortunately, that never happened. So between the motorway being built and actually there wasn't as much employment either. So the area really became just a wasteland. I think there's only 4 original houses left in Cedartown, but what we do have is St. Joseph's Church. So St. Joseph's Church and Parochial House are 2 listed buildings. The story behind what we're doing is that the church was the local Catholic church for the community down here, and it was going to be closed by the diocese in 1999. There was a very, very vocal campaign by all the people who were from Cedartown originally, who had been moved out. They came down in their droves and they basically objected vociferously, shall we say, to the closure of the church, because they felt very much that that was the last part of their community that was going to go. Once the church went, the sense of community would go as well. So I suppose it radicalized them in some sense, but they've been fighting ever since. They managed to get a lease on the church in 2006, but it was in a very bad condition. But luckily enough, we still have it, and we have been doing a major process of repair over the last 4 to 5 years. So we have now learned to call it an anchor institution to drive forward regeneration of the area. The stories in the name, I suppose. Cedartown Regeneration was set up in order to regenerate the area. So it's not just about saving a church, it's about bringing a community back down to live in Cedartown. Cedartown was always connected back into North Belfast, and actually it's connected across the river by a ferry boat as well. So a lot of the people working in the shipyards on the other side of the river would have travelled across there on Kelly's coal boats or the O'Prey boats. So it was a very, very connected place, but again, the motorway has completely disconnected it. So there was an image you showed earlier on, which was an aerial view of the motorway and the river. And really that was taken by a local fella down here, Declan, and it really shows quite vividly how Cedartown was cut off from the town. So we are now getting St. Joseph's Church restored as a community space. It will be very much community space. But really what we need, there's no point in us having a community space down here unless we're connected. So the York Street Interchange, in whatever form it comes in, will have a huge impact on basically what we're doing here. So we're looking to get connected back into North Belfast, back into the city centre, which is a very unsafe and a very unpleasant route to walk at the minute, and then across the bridge, across the river to East Belfast as well. So I think connectivity is key to any regeneration project and what we're doing down here. In terms of particularly the connection into North Belfast, there's a big emphasis in Belfast now on healthy walking, healthy cities. So we have noticed very much that there are a lot of people, we have a walk cycle trail running through here. We've noticed very much that particularly since lockdown, since COVID, there's a lot more people who are walking and cycling through here. It's always been a commuter route, but there's an awful lot more people now using it as a leisure route. In terms of North Belfast, again, there's a lot of people in North Belfast, particularly younger people who go to Belfast Met, also people who work in the service industries. Currently, what they have to do is, as you know, Mark, in North Belfast, it's nearly like it's cut off very much. So, but what we're looking at is if there was a bridge across the river there, people can walk down from the waterworks, Antrim Road or whatever, walk down Duncan and then go straight across a footbridge across the Titanic Quarter. I think really for us it's a no-brainer. But I suppose really we really want to bring a community back to live in Cedartown. One of the major impacts that the York Gate Interchange has had on us is that there are no shops down here. There are 3 bars, but if people are if people want to buy a pint of milk, they have to cross 7 sets of pedestrian lights. You'll see mummies out there bringing their kids to school. And I mean, you're taking 3 kids to school. You can hold one in each hand. There's another one running about you. There's heavy docks traffic going through. And I mean, it's horrendous having to go, for anybody having to walk that, never mind the shop. But I mean, bringing your kids to school through that is just awful. So I think really Cedartown I think maybe hopefully is on the cusp of a change. One of the things that we were told some time ago was that you are down there, you're volunteers basically. Okay, you have a listed building, but it's going to cost a lot of money. So what we did was we looked at the amount of money that was being spent around us on big development projects. So, for example, the new University of Ulster, I can't remember how many 100 millions, the York Street Interchange, 350 million, Titanic Quarter, the City Keys project. So if you look at the regeneration for people instead of office blocks and universities or whatever, you really need to inject some money back into the community. What we are is very much a locally led regeneration group here. We are led by what people in the area want. People in the area want safe spaces. They want safe travel. They want to have a locality where they can nip around the corner to the shop, where their kids can play. Our kids down here at the minute are just running the streets and sometimes getting into a wee bit of bother. But basically, you need a community that's connected, that people feel that they can talk to their neighbours. So hopefully the York Street Interchange, in whatever way it comes in, will assist us in what we're doing.
Okay, Terry, thank you very much. I was maybe now going to call on Professor Michael McGarry, because Michael, you're familiar with this area a little bit, and some of your students have been working on this, and I thought maybe you coming from another perspective. Michael, just to introduce Michael as well, you might even introduce yourself, Michael, in that sense, that you have worked on large projects in your younger years as an architect. You were working in Berlin. And,
yes. So first of all, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Terry. It's really it's a part of the city I'm really interested in, and it's really nice to see the range of people involved today, because I'm just going to make a general comment as an architect and as one of those people called a consultant, that in the past, within each of our professions, architects, planners, engineers, there was a tendency to stick in our silo, to stick in our box. And then if you like, the integration of things we were suggesting was left to others. And I think that age is over. So, and I think this kind of event is symptomatic of that. In other words, solutions won't arise unless everybody's around the table. And so that's the first point. Second one is just to compliment Mark on getting his head around what is technically a complex issue. And the motorway interchange, in fact, is, I've heard it described elsewhere, is the strategic motorway interchange for Northern Ireland. So, and it's good not to be naive about that actually there is a valid reason to have this kind of traffic once, if you like, manners are put on it and it's contained. But what I like about this work, and I think it gives it authenticity and gives it credibility, is that Mark has got his head around technically what are the issues. And we end up here now with the situation where, from my perspective, that the issue is not what should be done, but how it's done. And I think that's a major achievement. So I suspect I'd be very surprised if anybody would object or take issue with the substance of this strategic proposal. And just Mark asked me to comment on my own background, but I mean, there are common things here, obviously, that are not just, they're common to other cities, about traffic, about the introduction of cars and motorways. And then the other one, which an awful lot of cities have, is the change of status of rivers in cities. And 200 years ago, the river in most cities was the focus. If you think of London and you think of the engravings you see of London and all of the activity centered around the river, and then obviously river traffic changed, etc. And now this issue about how devastating rivers tend to be within existing cities, that they're very divisive. So if you like, the perfect storm that came about here, a river that effectively chops the city in half, and then a motorway that again chopped the city, if not in half, in quarters. And the fact that they're in the same location makes a double barrier to the kind of integration of East and West and Belfast, which is the essential dilemma about Belfast in terms of planning is the fact East and West are divided. And that's before the sectarian overlay, but just in simple terms of geography. So I think the discussion, is there might be left a bit about the framework plan and where things go, and but I think the issue now is the political adoption of this, because I do think it's a kind of a no-brainer. And then following from if you like, a political adoption will be an issue about how it gets delivered. And I share Mark's reservations about, and Belfast has mixed experience of relying on private development finance to make pieces of public infrastructure. And I think it's simply not good enough to risk strategic things about the city to private market. And again, that's not to be a naive, it's not to suggest there isn't a place for market forces. But I think you have to control this, or the city and its population need to be in charge of how this works its way out. And it doesn't end up started but incomplete, or doesn't end up being, let's say, downvalued in terms of the quality of the environment that is on offer here. So I would suggest vigilance about that. I'll stop at that, Mark, for the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. Maybe I'm going to bring Mary in now, but just to maybe clarify something that wasn't clear. We're at a situation where this road interchange has been designed, but is in stasis. It's been held up for around 4 or 5 years now. There's been a number of legal cases around contractors, so half of the audience wouldn't be aware of that. We're at a choice point where the project is being reviewed at the minute. And I think we do face a choice, a once in a century choice, really. Which way do we go forward? And I suppose what we've tried to do is show that there is a technical alternative that not only we think is better, but saves about £100 million. And that £100 million could be delivering in the same area many more things than just a motorway connection. But crucially, we would solve the road connections for all the major car users, because it's very important that we need to get that car movement working, because when it's stopping at lights, it's creating pollution. So that's even a local issue. We need to get this traffic as much as possible off Belfast streets and think about the 21st century. I think that's a great note then to bring in. You know, it's great having Mary Black, who's CBE, here, because Mary has sort of 40 years in public health. And as I alluded to, you know, public health used to have a great influence on planning and architecture. And we didn't think so much in our silos 4 or 5 decades ago. And I think we've witnessed as architects and planners, we certainly are very acutely aware of the kind of weakness that we're in at the minute, where because we're so fractured. And I think that's really what I'm hoping, you know, Mary, it's great to have you here today. I'm wondering what your reaction is to what you've seen so far.
Sure. Thanks very much, Mark. I mean, I just think this is such an exciting day. And the content of the contributions are really stimulating what we all, and I think in our hearts, know makes sense, which is to connect people with their environment and build a better community, a better quality of life, and through that, better health and well-being. You know, it really is just so stark when you see it like this. What I'm going to do is say a little bit about Healthy North Belfast, the process around Healthy North Belfast and where we've come to. And then I'd like to make a few reflections based on that experience to today's topic and discussion. And maybe we can pick up some of those things later, you know, in discussion. So the first thing just to say is that I'm an independent facilitator for Healthy North Belfast, but of itself, that process is built on many years of work and indeed many individuals who have contributed to shaping that. I became part of it in September 2018, in fact, when I was in my paid role before I retired from the service. So a coalition made up of local politicians from both City Council and Antrim and Newton Abbey Council, together with statutory, community and voluntary organisations, as well as local MLAs. Our politicians have stayed with this process since September 2018, and that has been a great strength to that diverse coalition. And they came together because health was so important to all of those interests. It is critically important, obviously, first and foremost to the community. And we have a great deal of evidence about the poor health of residents in North Belfast. But what was different about Healthy North Belfast was it was starting from a place of saying, using the appreciative inquiry process to say, and what do we like about living in North Belfast? What is good about North Belfast? As well as acknowledging the very real problems that we face. So Healthy North Belfast has a number of stages, and the first was gathering together all of the information called the discovery phase. So what does the evidence tell us about the pattern of health in North Belfast? And you won't be surprised to hear, because many of you will be familiar with it, that it has stark inequality patterns of health. Patterns of inequality, but really deep-seated patterns of deprivation. So of the 100 deprived super output areas, 5 of the most deprived super output areas are in North Belfast, coupled with high unemployment, poorer education outcomes, poorer health outcomes, and so on. So we were in no doubt about the scale and the evidence that was in front of us. But where the appreciative inquiry goes further is, as I say, to gather, and what do people say about this? What is their view about this? And in particular, how do we develop a whole system approach to improving health? And it is fascinating that in terms of what people said about this, there were 1,014 face-to-face interviews coupled with online survey. And what people told us is what they liked about North Belfast, what they valued about North Belfast, and what they would like to make better in North Belfast. And of course, that's coming at it from a completely different way. It's not looking at the deficits, it's looking at the assets, it's looking at the strengths of the area. And they constantly mentioned a number of themes. Things like the importance of physical activity, not only for its own sake, but also because it connected them to each other and to places. The link between food, happiness, and health, concern about loneliness and mental health and well-being, the importance of social connections to their health. So social connection kept coming up. And the value of the attractive environment that is North Belfast. People appreciated the river, they appreciated the hills, Cave Hill and so on. They were aware of the value of the natural asset in their neighbourhoods. And then finally more information about what was available. So we pulled together all of that information, and from that discovery phase and the dream phase of what would make it better emerged 6 themes of work. And they were regeneration, safe and attractive environment, physical activity, mental health and well-being, social connections, and improving access to services. And you won't be surprised to hear that that whole process was based on co-design and co-production. So 6 groups attacked those 6 themes and produced a draft implementation plan over a period of about 6 to 8 months. And of course, then we had COVID. So we had to reconfigure like everybody else and say, well, what do we do with this rich, really rich source of information, and how do we keep this alive, because this is just too important to drop. And one of the things that really was at the heart of all of this was that commitment from community organisations and the support of our local politicians. And throughout their encouragement about the positiveness and because of the need for this process has been a very important factor. So having drafted an implementation plan, we're now at the stage of the doing. and moving it into an actual reality. And there are a number of issues why I think that's very important. And Mark reflected on this at the start. There is a strong history of public health and creating a built environment that nurtures and supports health and well-being. But there are a couple of other reflections that I'd like to make. The first is, why is it important? And the first of those is that this is people's views. We have confidence in the views that people have expressed, and it is their neighbourhood and it is their community. And we all know that working together, we will create a much stronger, better solution. But it also requires us, demands of us, that we listen to those views. And the programme for government rightly espouses co-production and co-design. Here we are. Here is a custom-built, ready-made piece of work ready to be lifted up to the next level. Secondly, the second opportunity I see, despite all the sacrifices that have been required through COVID, is that it actually presents a really unique opportunity. We are having to pause and rethink everything in our lives at the minute. This provides us with a really fantastic opportunity to rethink, redesign, and actually in that way create an entirely new kind of way of developing a better quality of life. And thirdly, we know we can learn from history. We understand much more about inequalities now. We know what we can do to structure an environment that promotes equality. But equally, we know that whilst we have seen improvements over my 40 years in health, in education, in income levels, we have not all improved at the same rate. Therefore, we know that the disparity remains, and that is a big challenge for us going forward. But history also teaches us, and the evidence is very strong now, about what is effective in terms of tackling health inequalities. So, coupled with the experience that we've all lived through with the pandemic, we now have a unique opportunity to recreate and build things that are different and more in tune with where local people actually are. We don't only have our own views on this. We know that the World Health Organization has highlighted this kind of thinking for many years, and they've attributed the improvements in health to 10% being health and social care, 35% based on social protection, 29% in living conditions, and 19% in terms of social reaction. Those are the kinds of factors that will actually lead to improvements in health and well-being and a reduction in inequality. And we have the means at our disposal. I also think it's very important that we reflect on the good evidence we now have about the powerful role of the environment. And if just for a second we think about air quality, we also recently had the Coroner's Court adjudicate on the very sad case of Ella Adu Kissi Deborah. Apologies for my pronunciation. But that was really the first time air pollution was seen to have been a material contribution to her death, a young child dying from asthma because of the quality of the air based on traffic pollution in her part of London. So we have a number of things coming together here that offer another opportunity, and that is climate change, tackling the environment and getting a win-win in terms of health and well-being with the environment that post-COVID hopefully allows us to be a little bit more creative. And maybe just to finish, I mean, I think that strong tradition that Mark referred to, let's just think about what that strong tradition of public health and planning and the environment actually would mean in today's world. So, okay, in the 1800s, it was fresh, clean water that was the determinant and really led to the public water supply for Belfast. And of course, we've got the Belfast Charitable Society, even in the 1740s, developing the importance of water for the people of Belfast. Down in Clifton House, not hardly, you know, where we are actually based. So there's a very strong tradition there. But let's just for a second imagine, what do those principles mean now? Well, what they mean is exactly the sort of thing that people are saying it means. Allow us more opportunity to walk, to cycle, to connect with our friends, to have green spaces where our children can play, and where we are protected from the negative impact perhaps of some of those environmental factors like pollution and fumes and so on. So we have to dream a little bit wild here and be a little bit bold, because it is, I think, a unique opportunity. We also know that we can do it because, for example, we have within Queen's the Centre for Excellence, Professor Frank Key and Ken Sterrett and others, Geraint Ellis, have been working, and we have excellent examples of good practice in the east of the city, the Connswater Greenway. Belfast Healthy Cities have been working over many years to develop urban planning. But let's lift it up a bit. Let's raise the scale of that and just imagine what would be possible if we make the value of health and well-being at the heart of what we do when we plan our cities. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. And I think we're going to move to a round table and get a wider discussion, but I'd like to welcome Tony Fretton from London. I mean, I think when Mary talks about, you know, raising the scale and, you know, turning things into delivery, all of us architects would know Tony's work over a number of decades, very careful making of buildings, and increasingly, Tony, you've been involved in housing, more, I believe, in the Netherlands, public housing, and maybe you want to show some slides and just cue me when you want to do that. But I'd just like to say, Tony, from the architect side, we're really welcome and interested to see you here today. And from a personal basis, I remember I met you in Edinburgh about 4 or 5 years ago, and it was just very encouraging to have a beer afterwards and your words at that time. So, Tony, I mean, I was just wondering what you reflect. It's obviously a very wide theme, and you're kind of, I think, interested in the architect's role of delivering some spaces, maybe that.
Well, I mean, I can't talk to the level of issues of the other speakers, but I can say what architects can and should and have to do when finally a project is delivered from the kind of conditions you're describing. And quite often it's in a part of the city which has been ravaged in the way that Belfast has been by road structures. And so cities aren't anymore well-ordinated entities with streets. They've got holes ripped in them. Or if they're not like that in London, you're working on a peripheral location, which was a brownfield site, which was a factory or something like that. And so what one does as an architect, well, what I observe is that quite often in the situations I'm describing, you just see a sort of zoo of modern architecture with no visual connection with the surroundings, no social connection with the surroundings. And that is something that we work very hard as a practice not to do. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to show, Mark has some images for me, a project we finished a couple of years ago in Ghent in Belgium. Now, this, first of all, I want to say this isn't, although it's similar in size to the location that's being projected by Mark in Belfast, it's a different situation, and each project has to take account of where it is, because, as I said, the locations have been stripped of any contextual information. So there's an outright desire to Mark, can you go back a bit? Sorry.
Sorry, Tony, it's on a timer, so
Yeah,
I'll
can you
just show
put your
it.
finger on the timer so it can't? Otherwise, I won't
Yes.
have said anything. Sorry. So what I was going to say was that one works very, very hard to establish something plausible which connects with the surrounding district and yet has to be new. So this is a housing project in Ghent on the site of a garage, an original car garage. So the street which it's on is very trafficked. So the gardens inside around which the buildings are organized has a glass screen. It's not a gated community. It's free access for everybody, but it means that those gardens are quiet. So if you sit in there, they're quiet. And if we go to the next one, Mark, the next slide shows the plan. And then to the next one, what we did is we made these internal courts. Can you move to the next?
Yeah, it's a bit slow, Tony, that's all.
Okay. So we could make an array of buildings along the street. Now the road was busy, as I say, and one of the needs, I'd say, in any project is to animate the street, usually with some commerce, but commerce didn't really work here. If one looked at the other side of the street, it had all failed. So we felt that these gardens were the street animation at large scale. Do you change?
Next slide.
Yeah, next slide, thanks. So the gate's always open, you can go in, and it animates the street. It makes the neighborhood feel better. And in a way, it's not unlike Paris or other cities which have courtyards where there's more of the city than you can actually go into or live in. But it's public space for the eye. Do you change? And so it's very simple inside. It's attuned to the Flemish idea of the city, a classical city of vertical windows and balconies. Very, very simple construction, affordable construction. Do you change? And so moments where the detail matters, and you need that in a building. You need an intense view as an architect of how you can make every conjunction really be something where somebody walking by it will puzzle over it and then finally understand why it is that way. And buildings not only have a duty to give people houses, but they have a duty to give pleasure to the eye and intelligence to the eye. Do you change again? And so, I mean, these are rather luxurious apartments, but you can see the kind of thing that you can do with some effort. Change. And the scheme brings in elements from the surrounding as you live on the upper level. This is some sheltered housing on the roof, and so the people in the sheltered housing get to see the local landmarks. Change again.
I think that's the last slide, Tony.
That's the last slide. Then that's it. So, I mean, this is, as I just want to reinforce, this isn't a solution for the location that's projected in Belfast, and that would be totally different. And also the architecture would be different, because if it were more of a cooperative project which came about through consultation, its aspect would be different. But I show this just to say that things don't stop when you've established the site and cleared the surroundings and made everything work. Architecture starts then, and a lot of architecture that we work in, and we're currently working on a project in Hasselt, and all the surrounding projects are not thoughtful of what it's like to be in a public space, and not community forming, not community forming in the way that traditional cities are community forming. So architects have to fight back against that, against the generalization of architecture. So that's my contribution here, and I'd be happy to be in the discussion.
Okay, thank you very much, Tony. But I mean, we're going to shift soon to a kind of general discussion and batting off, and maybe the speakers will just come forward to me as they want. But just maybe final comments of have I stopped sharing? Okay, Ken Sterrett. Ken's a colleague of mine from when we worked in the Forum for Alternative Belfast, but Ken's been working for maybe 20, 30 years, Ken, you used to work in various kind of community planning within government, and then you shifted to academia. And I know you're on the board of a number of inner city community organizations, and you've been known for at least the last 2 decades, Ken, as somebody who's been working at the nitty gritty of planning and community issues within Belfast and within divided societies as well, but also in areas of high deprivation. And Ken, you're familiar with this work in a way over the years, so, and we've co-authored some work together. So I thought it'd be good to bring you in, Ken, just to give a reflection as well, or maybe you could lead off the discussion and prompt a few questions of us as well.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, well, the discussion's been very interesting so far. And I made a few notes as I was listening to others, because in a way, if we were to get down the route of embracing the scheme that you have put forward, Mark, which of course I would endorse wholeheartedly, then we've got to see what we can learn from the mistakes of the past and so on. And Michael made a very good point earlier. He was saying about the sort of silos that we lived in, you know, in terms of planners, engineers, architects, all living within their own defined discipline. And not often straying outside of that to work together in a multidisciplinary way. But I would argue that is the case, or has been the case, but also that has been a characteristic of government planning as well, insofar as if we look back at the way in which planning has functioned over the last 40, 50 years, it has been very minimalist. It has been risk averse. It has tended not to be very strategic or indeed comprehensive. It has tended to sort of make plans and then sit back and wait on the market to deliver them without being proactive in creating things. And it has tended to be what I would call sort of site focused. In other words, just looking at individual sites as being appropriate or otherwise for particular developments. So I think if we're going to move forward with something which is much more in tune with what people want in the city, and to address the issues that have been raised around North Belfast, then it has to be a way forward that is underpinned by a different set of values, essentially. And those values, I think, are about being more comprehensive, and they're also about being more strategic. And I think that we also need, as I said earlier, to be more proactive. Now, in a sense, you know, Mark and Declan and I, when we were operating the forum, we had some really good, healthy discussions around things. And I used to say to Mark and Declan, you know something, I completely agree with your analysis and what you're saying, but it's too physical. It's too much about the physical environment. You've got to embrace the other dimensions of how people experience life, you know, the social, the economic, the cultural, and so on and so forth. So I think in looking ahead at how we progress planning as a whole within the city, but in particular this part of Belfast, we've got to say, okay, we can create a physical environment that addresses the issue of disconnection, and that's central to what Mark is advocating here. But also that we think about, you know, what sort of environment we want that will address the issues that Mary has raised about community health and so on and so forth. And therefore, we're beginning to think about where people work, how people socialize. Do we want, for example, to have new housing areas that replicate the sins of the past, in a sense, you know, having separation between those from different religious backgrounds, but also separation between different social classes? Do we not start to think about mixed tenure housing, for example? Do we think about mixed use development? Do we begin to think about the living environment being so much different, or potentially so much different, than the environment we had before the pandemic? Now, one of the arguments we used to make in the forum was, look, this city has been designed for the car. Over 100,000 people traveled in every day, not now, obviously, but over 100,000 people traveled in every day as commuters to work in the city, and they went back out again, leaving behind the inner city communities and so on to live a life that was affected by the pollution that came from that, but also affected by the economics that came from that as well. So again, we've got to think about how we address these issues in a much more strategic way than we did in the past, and to think in terms of the sort of environment that would work, not just for North Belfast or inner North Belfast, but for the rest of the city. One of the other points we used to make in our case about the city itself was that during the course of the Troubles, the conflict, people became very insulated insofar as they stayed within their own safe environments, understandably so. But so how does the city as a whole begin to open up so that people will feel like free to leave those environments, safe to leave those environments, and to explore the rest, and you make use of the rest of the city? And of course, we used to quote the point that the whole city should be our neighbourhood rather than one small part of it. So again, that's something that would need to be factored into the way in which we would take all of this forward. Terry made a good point earlier on as well, just about the number of big schemes that are either underway in the course of being implemented, or indeed have been part or will be part of what's happening within this general area. And we used to make that same point. We used to say, look, you've got these major investments, but first of all, they're not connected anyway. Nobody has thought about how one connects to the other, or indeed what one or all together can deliver for local communities. That was very seldom thought through. So if we're moving forward again to address an issue like that, then goes back to the point I think Mary was talking about, which was about co-design, co-production. In other words, we don't just sit back and wait for either government or the private sector or whatever to deliver something. We develop a vision of what we want to achieve in this case. And we're very fortunate to have the detailed sort of workings of a scheme that Mark has already set out quite clearly. To have something like that and to see how that can be taken forward collectively, meaning government, local and central, the private sector, but also crucially local communities. And I think that's something that we could feature, you know, in our discussion about how we actually do this. We need to think about how can we do this? How can we actually achieve this? And I'll leave it at that for the moment, Mark.
Yeah, Ken, thanks. I mean, I think one thing that's coming across is from everybody is the challenge that I know on the built environment side, we've always felt for the last decades is that we realize we're working in incredibly fractured environments. I think Michael and Tony, you'd share my view that, you know, architecture is not quite what we signed up for. Certainly it wasn't when I signed up. I thought architecture was a different beast than it ended up becoming in the last decades. And I know, Tony, you kind of expressed that view often in London as well, that, you know, how the kind of lack of context for us to work in. So we end up trying to find context in other ways because we don't actually have a political context or a kind of drawing together agenda that, you know, did exist post-war. There was a kind of clarity about what people wanted to do post-war. There might be issues about how it was delivered, but certainly we look back now and we probably look back at that post-war reconstruction all over the world and think it got bad press during the 70s and 80s, but actually when you look back at it now, it achieved a huge amount that still has value. And it feels like in post-COVID world, we really do have to reassess, as Mary says, you know, we've got to work in a different way because in Belfast, certainly, you know, 20 years of redevelopment hasn't solved the wicked issues of the city. You know, we're facing a number of enormous challenges in Belfast through our regeneration strategies. So here it does seem there's a point for co-design. It's interesting, Mary, that you talk about that being very crucial in government at the highest level, to say the co-design, which means that people really have to sit in a room and thrash things out. And that's possibly a virtual room at the minute, but it is that idea that you can't actually come with hugely set positions. You've got to be willing to shift. So, Michael, I wonder, do you want to come back on anything that you've picked up from all the discussions?
Well, just following from that, I'd make 2 points about, you know, and not to over-personalize it about us architects, but that's, I mean, I think what's happened generally as a trend in society that that on the one hand, there's a growing complexity about everything, and that has further pushed people into silos. So in other words, be it traffic or be it architecture, that the issues are so complex, please leave me alone and I'll find the solution. And when I'm ready, I'll tell you what the solution is. So that pattern is there. And then the other one, which is more invidious, is, which you're referring to, is I have to say, a kind of collapse in, and it's not specific to Belfast or Northern Ireland, but a collapse, I would say, in confidence in what a public realm means. And I mean, not just the public realm as in streets and spaces, but actually what is civic society? And I think that a lot of it has unraveled. On the plus side, which I think is really important, and I think it's really evident in Belfast and at grassroots level, that there is an impatience combined with a far greater expectation as to what civic life would bring. And I'm not talking about, welfare payments or anything like that, but just as being part of a society, what would society give and support you and surround you with? And I think that's palpable, that the general public's expectation about cities, I mean, it's really evident in Belfast, that even at just grassroots level, and what people anticipate because they've been to other cities or they're aware of other cities and they see things happening in other cities and they're wondering, why aren't we getting a piece of that? So that's happening, I suppose, irrespective and independent of political change, which, from top down. So I find that really encouraging. And I only mentioned the other two negatives, I suppose, just in a way, part of a professional responsibility. A professional responsibility we have, to take responsibility for previous failures, and I think we have to be upfront about that.
Could I step in here? One difference between the lowlands and the UK is that the UK planning system is confrontational, and there's been a 30-year unquestioned belief that the market should deliver everything. And so to counter that, the Mayor's office and other functionaries have attempted to make demands on developers. But in Holland and Belgium, it's done differently. The city itself issues master plans for significant sites. Not always, but generally, especially where they have some visual or social significance. Now, those plans are not always good, but at least they're planned. And it means that the democratic process, which in the UK happens far too late in the form of objections to anything now, the democratic process is much earlier, where the city officials, with or without proper consultation, but usually with some consultation, formulate ways that the city could be. And listening to what's being said here, that there's enough structure of, let's say, local representation and local knowledge to inform planning like that. And that's where you might counteract what's been said about the fractured nature of development. So that's fantastically important. The other thing is that in Holland, when you submit a scheme, you'll laugh at this, but you go before a beauty committee. The beauty committee, it's actually called the Avail Standards Committee. It means the beauty committee. The beauty committee consists of very significant architects. Architects of the same caliber as oneself. So you don't get any kind of pettiness. You get people who are local architects of high quality who are invested in their city, and they see your work. And I've seen, we've been through several of those, and they're terrific, actually, very affirmative. So there are systems in Europe which could be applied here. But if you just rely on developers to deliver, you won't get quality, and you won't get social spaces that mean anything. It'll just be honorific, because developers don't want to provide any real social space, and they don't understand what it is. in a developer's mind, it's a tree or a street, but it's not how a door is entered from the street, how a window overlooks it, all those things that really make a city. Development can't do that unless it's very powerfully compelled by, let's say, a sense of civic patriotism represented in codes of development. That's what you have to do, I think.
I mean, I think it's a good point, Tony, in that in Belfast, we really have a market failure in many levels, that development only really flows to the very few parts of the city that have some connectivity and structure. So what you find is the developers can't borrow the money, can't gain the confidence to actually build. We have a lot of projects churning through a planning system, but they're not, in a sense, real projects because they've no prospect of being built, because they don't inspire enough confidence even in their own lenders and loaners and so on. And so we get very partial development, and I think we need to recognize at a higher level that really the private sector market has always failed in Belfast to achieve most of what we wanted to achieve. But there's still too much of a mindset that that's going to be the delivery mechanism, and we're not using, it's maybe time to bring in Mary again. I sort of think it's so palpable in Belfast that we're very frustrated with our planning system. The statistics recently from Queen's University about, I think it was Cardiff and Queen's together did some research, and the confidence in planning is at near zero. So we do need to rethink our planning system before we go any further down our local development plan. But also, we're not tapping into the skills and energy of our people, Mary, and Terry. I think it's so palpable in what we see going on that the enormous skills and resources of communities, health professionals, joined up thinking, people who can think at that level are not called upon to contribute to our city. And it is this issue of fragmentation. We think certain things are only done by certain people and that they are the only people who can do that. And the actual issue is that creating and recreating a city for the 21st century is going to be an enormous challenge, I think. We probably do need to have a different set of values, because I think it's also something that Mary said, that there's a presumption that many of us are making in that remaking streets is somehow a vehicle, though we are uncertain about what a street is anymore. It doesn't necessarily have to be about buildings. It certainly, as Tony pointed out very carefully, it rarely can be about commerce at ground floor if there isn't the appetite for that. So we've got to find ways of making conduits and streets through our cities that are safe, but they may not be the old streets of past. We're going to have to find creative new ways of doing it. So Mary, did you have any reflections on all those architects and planners speaking there?
I think it's fascinating because, I absolutely understand the dilemma of it, relying on developers. That seems to me such a paucity, when that public space is for the public good. So how we design and develop for the public good is really at the nub of the issue here. As you say, the one thing that we have here in Belfast, and indeed in other parts of Northern Ireland, but the one thing we have is this fabulous resource of local wisdom and intelligence about what would make life better. And we just listened to Terry's example of a mother trying to get her 3 children to school. I mean, if any of you have ever walked in from North Belfast along York Street, I mean, it's just not possible to have a nice walk because of all those fragmented junctions that you come to that are not designed to take account of, a human being. So we definitely can do better. And, I think it is about espousing values that will enshrine those qualities that we want to see that will improve the quality of life. And that can be economic life as well as physical life and so on. And one other thought that I have, and that is COVID presenting an opportunity, but also through COVID, we have seen a reassessment of public service and the public realm, if you like. Now, that is also something that I think has provoked people into thinking what might have been, on the one hand, before COVID, a natural dilution almost of public service has seen that become re-established because of what was required and the people who were most needed when we faced the emergency. So the one other thing about health is that it has managed to remain neutral. Health and well-being is above party politics, it would appear, for the most part. And that is a space, therefore, both on a thematic area and specifically allows us to have the kind of conversations that perhaps are just, you know, nuanced too much in other quarters. I'm not sure, but I think, you know, if you can have a common goal, I think health and well-being and quality of life are important, and people can gather around that.
Could I also say, what strikes me is that a master plan for the city is needed, and I'll say two things. The other is that a local authority housing after 1945 came about through compulsory purchase. It wasn't a market-led solution. In fact, a lot of housing which had been privately developed and had fallen into ruin because there wasn't enough profit in renting was bought. And so you only got the volumes of housing through an action that would now be seen as immoral or running against the ideas of capitalism. But we are beginning to see a recognition, even in the British government, that government has a role. And the model in the Netherlands, ever since they built the dikes to keep the sea away, was that business and government work hand in hand. You know, they have a mutuality. In the UK, they're opposed to each other, you know, instinctively opposed to each other. And that's why you won't get a joined up city unless you have large-scale strategies that can be implemented and developers have to attend to. You know, the project we're doing in Hassel right now, you get a plan from the city where you can build and what you can build and what heights there are and what disposition it is. And that means as an architect, you meet some difficulties, but it means you know exactly what you're doing and things go quickly. In the UK, developers try to winnow out as much possible profit in the land, and then they sell it, you know, and then somebody else can't build. So I don't think we're going to get anywhere in the UK with the way that we're doing it right now. Not the kind of positive results that this location demands.
I suppose I feel, having looked at this for over a long period of time, that there's a need for a different approach here, in that much of the land that I'm talking about is publicly owned and currently can't be developed because of the issue around the road. But if the road is agreed in a different way, that public land can be dispersed and controlled in a different way. So I suppose what I'm advocating for is everything on the map that I've shown today, you know, that whole zone is a special zone. It is the key to solving this part of the city. It can only, in my view, happen if we pull it out of the current processes and into something different, a different vehicle. And I've called it a land trust, and I've sort of called it, the most important thing is values. I think we've all talked about the need to start from values, you know, right from Terry's comment, as you've picked up, the value has to be, can I cross the road with my 3 kids? You know, that's your starting point. And as a father of a 2-year-old now walking along streets in Belfast, which are nowhere near as bad as this, you really do start to notice a difference, you know, when you've got your family. So we've got to appeal to this, you know, very complicated, large thing that we're talking about. It does have to rock it down, Terry, to, you know, the simple values of being able to safely walk anywhere. That's not some sort of, David Harvey talks about the right to the city. And I think, you know, you don't have a city if you can't actually walk everywhere. Being in a car is a privilege and maybe a way of getting around faster. Being on a bus isn't even a necessity. Even being on a bike isn't a necessity. But, you know, if you can't walk through a city, you're really in diffs. Terry, you want to come back on, have you any thoughts provoked out of the discussion?
Yeah, so a couple of things. First of all, the importance of community, the people who actually live here, and they're saying it. because, I mean, and people are talking about, you know, learning from the mistakes of the past. Now, when the York Street Interchange was put in, some of the people down here were quite happy to move, because a lot of the housing here was slum housing. A lot of it was very poor housing. People will tell you about how, you know, how bad it was. What there was a real sense of community. So some people, when the houses and the tower blocks and that were being built in Belfast, some of the people here were happy enough to move because they were getting indoor heating, they were getting, you know, hot and cold running water, an indoor toilet, whatever. But what happened when they got there was that, and then some of them moved to the bigger estates on the outskirts of Belfast, fresh air, the hills around you, green fields and that. But what happened when they got out there was they very quickly realised that they had now become isolated. They missed their, when you were living in Sailortown, and why it is such a strong community spirit is that your next door neighbour was your best mate. Your sister lived across the street, your granny lived around the corner, there was a corner shop. So that sense of connectedness, and I think the best one in the world, when planners are looking at something and they're looking at roads and connectivity and that, and how to get from A to B and how to get to work, you're completely missing out the value of family. You're completely missing out the value of people actually living with children, who the children want to go out and play on the street, they want to play with their mates. I mean, you're seeing that happening all around now, the world now, where kids aren't allowed out. We're still quite fortunate down here in that our kids are running the streets. Having to say that they can be a bit, I don't know how to, a bit naughty maybe would be the polite term for it, but these kids are fantastic, they're creative. So really, I think and it's a point somebody else made about that standalone projects. This is consistently happening in Belfast, where something is done, like at the minute they're talking about upgrading York Gate Station. Now we know, because we live here and we walk past that station and use that station, what needs to be done to that station. But again, what's happening with that station is they have red lines around the outside of it. There's no consideration given to the connectivity. There's no consideration given to how people walk here. We know through living here, the routes that people take, they'll actually take a shorter route to go across a place where there's no pedestrian crossing. Once you start to talk to local people who live here, who know the area, they will tell you what's needed. It might be a much more maybe difficult process for the consultants or the planners and that, but you really need to get people out in the streets, talking to the people who live here, and design from the bottom up, not from the top down. So, sorry, I can go in a bit of rant sometimes.
Yeah, no, that's what everybody needs. And I mean, I think, you know, Mary, you mentioned co-design, that the only way out of this, I think, has to be co-design. But the most important thing about co-design is the issue of power in the room. There can't be one group or one veto in any profession or so on. You've actually, co-design is what communities really want. I think we have to end this word consultation. In fact, consultation, when you think about it, we're consultation out in Belfast. We don't want anybody actually asking us what to do anymore. You know, I think communities and people and stakeholders in Belfast need to be part of a co-design process where what you bring to the table is sifted and understood by other people and affects their change. And a co-design process means that everybody is shifting their perspective. Everybody must be prepared to shift their perspective at every level. Otherwise, it's not co-design, and consultation doesn't work. I have a couple of roles to do here as chair. One to say is that there's a poll coming up, and maybe that will start to appear for people viewing. And I think there's 2 questions. So maybe if you can respond to that, viewers, and maybe that might come up on the screen soon. I think it's 2 simple questions. I'm just scanning through questions that are coming in here, and I think we'll struggle to answer a lot of them, but this is going to be recorded and you can come back across items and so on in the show. You know, there's a comment, you know, certainly we need young people to express their views of the city of the future. I think all of us here realize we don't really have a fixed idea about what the city of the future has to be in the 21st century. I think many of us are realizing we can't build our way out of it. It may well have to be a lot more about green space, certainly about getting out of our car. The 15-minute neighborhood is something that people have been talking about more in COVID, that we really need to have things. And really, to your point, Terry, there's Ken, one of the things we pointed out years ago, there's no inner city school in Belfast. It's just incredible that there's no inner city primary school. So one of the things that we could proactively do to stimulate a neighborhood and new development in the city centre and people living back in the city Because one of the interesting things about Belfast is that our whole commercial city core has very, very few people living in it. So people are all living in a wider area out from the city. So a school is one thing somewhere in the city centre that people could start to walk around, the parents could start to build confidence around. Some of the other things coming through in terms of questions, I think we might be able to get back to some of them, but you know, I think all of them are things that we're talking about here. But I think what really is, just wondering, does anyone want to make another contribution about where we are? I think we're maybe drawing to a close in a way.
Well, could I, sorry, just one more thing. It's interesting that Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher could deregulate the whole of Docklands in order that it could not have to make any contribution to the local authority, or it took local authority control away. And it's not inconceivable that it could be decided to do a social version of that in the centre of Belfast, where you reduce the effect of the local authority planning and you have a different structure which makes things go quickly and makes things go properly. But just listening here, that any master planning, if it took time, is drawing on a resource that's enormous in comparison with the UK, where views are not by any means nearly as keenly formulated. So the basis here for a proper master plan is very, very great.
I think, Tony, picking up on that, I mean, it was one of the things we discussed was one of the great benefits, you know, Northern Ireland and Belfast have is over decades, we have an incredibly strong third sector. You know, we have quite organized communities in many respects. Because of the conflict, because of what happened, there is a kind of other ethos in Northern Ireland where the public sector is quite a big proportion of the population and the working population, but so is the third sector. And you know, we do have a creative sector in the city as well, which we don't make enough use of. I'm kind of musing as well that I'm looking here at 3 or 4 architects and planners, and I really struggle to think of one architect and planner in public service in Northern Ireland, because I think there's nobody, we don't have anything akin to a city planner or city architect who speaks out from a series of values, who asserts what should happen in the city. We're really missing strong leadership in that sense that you get in other cities. As you know, many cities, for good or evil or good or bad, you know, they do have somebody who will speak out about these issues. And
well, Flemish cities and Dutch cities have what's called a Rijksbouwmeester, not right, a Stadsbouwmeester, city chief architect, who says, we're not going to build that, we're going to build this. You know? And sometimes it works, but it works better than the free market model that we're talking about.
Yeah. So I think we have an opportunity here to take this huge sector of land and do something different. I mean, I think that's my read of what's been going on. In a sense, the motorway has created a vacuum here because it's been quite complicated. People can't get their head around it. Therefore, they, for a long time, didn't have an opinion about it. I think that's starting to change. I think we're also recognizing that our city centre in Belfast is facing more and more challenges post-COVID, because we are a city that relied far too much on people driving in and on office blocks and on commerce and sorry, mainly shopping. So we didn't really have so many drivers. Tourism is also going to be, you know, a huge challenge for the next 5 years. Do we really see our tourism industry coming back? And one of the things that's always been frustrating is tourist-led regeneration. You know, that the most important thing is to make the city work for the people who live here. If it's good for the people who live here, it'll work very nicely for anyone who wants to visit. And that we really, again, got to assert those values, that we absolutely have to put people who live in any area right at the top of the chain. And it is interesting that when you look at road engineering, the official view in policy is that the pedestrian is first. The pedestrian is king in policy, and the road user in vehicles is last, and the cyclist is in between. That is the official policy. So powers and policy are there to totally and utterly change the way the city works. And I know that, for instance, we do have a bolder vision that is working between 3 departments now. So there is a real chance that this bolder vision could be really, really, really bold and start to make the kind of shift that we need in the city. But I think one of our other sessions, maybe advertise the next 2 sessions coming up as well. The next session, I believe, is Great Places. And that's a kind of example where I've been working with, as a consultant and working with a group of listed building owners. And we've been looking at a number of these junctions, and we've been working on a kind of co-design model. We've been pulling in expertise. We've been working with the civil service. And we've been working in this thing called the Bolder Vision for Belfast, which is really about the issue of roads and connectivity and walking. And it is interesting that that model is starting to deliver change. So that's a kind of mini example of this session for anyone wanting to come in tomorrow. And has anyone else got any kind of comments? Michael, do you want to come out from the shadows there?
So sorry. Well, I would reiterate the point about where design happens within a city authority, and be it city architect or city planner. And I think that vacuum is really problematic. And sometimes it doesn't work brilliantly, but I think the idea that the city has to be curated, physically curated, as well as socially, but at least physically as well, is a very different attitude than the current, I suppose, the tradition within Britain and Ireland about what planning is for. And we see planning in terms of the control of something. We don't see planning as an active design activity. And Tony referred to the Netherlands, but in mainland Europe, it's very well established that planning is a creative discipline rather than simply a set of controls. So, and I think one way to unpick that would be to say, who is responsible for the design of Belfast? And I mean design at the widest level. I don't mean what colour the bricks are, but actually, how is Belfast as an entity thought of creatively?
I think maybe pick up on that point, Michael, and go to Mary, that a huge positive, as I said, is that we have a really strong third sector, and we have a lot of work done. And Healthy North Belfast, I think Mary has a really good framework already going for a couple of years, and that's one vehicle to start to look at these thorny issues. Do you have any thoughts there, Mary? And how do we bring this forward?
Yeah, and I suppose that there's 2 points I would make. I think, before I come to the community and Healthy North Belfast, I think, listen, COVID has and will mean that we have to reimagine cities. They are not going to be the same, even when we get out of the pandemic, because we have already demonstrated that work and commerce and everything else in life can be done differently. And so what we have to do is use that experience for a positive to reimagine and redesign what the city will be like. And of course, that means its connections, because Belfast city centre will be different, and it'll be several years before we know exactly what the shape of that will be. But why not get in now and shape and change and design that with people so that we create a much more holistic, much more health-giving kind of city, and we'll be ahead. Let's make Belfast to be one of those places that grab that opportunity out of the real sadness and sacrifice of the pandemic, which is undeniable. But let's take something good out of that experience. So that's number one. And number two, as you say, Mark and Terry knows this. I mean, the richness of the experience and the communities in North Belfast and the city as a whole can be used as a major resource. And this business of co-design and co-production, let's not make the mistake of using that as yet another consultation term. It has to be active engagement. It has to be real. It has to have integrity, because then it'll be rooted in the values and principles that we all espouse. And then your product, the actual product out of that process, will be much stronger. There is one thing about co-design and co-production that I think is really important that we take on board, and that is that there's a natural power imbalance in there. Local communities and community organisations are often ill-resourced. So they're all doing it on a wing and a prayer or a wee bit of a grant from somebody. It's short term and it's fragmented. So statutory organisations can get annoyed about that they're not organised the way we like them to be organised, and they're not easy to deal with, and they've all sorts of other issues. But that power imbalance means that you must recognise the need to support in a very empowering way communities' engagement, because their voice is so important. But you need to recognise how you get all those voices around the table and make sure that those voices are heard properly. So that would be a thought.
I think that's a really good way to maybe try and wrap up the discussion on a positive, Mary, is that, you know, as you say, co-design is a way out of this. And I think one of the great things about co-design is it's also risk sharing. You know, we always worry about the risks, and there is, you know, as you walk forward in any very complicated process, there's risks to be managed, but a risk shared is a risk halved. And that's a very important thing. We all rush to avoid risk. Actually, we need to take it on jointly. And I think that's part of what co-design does. It takes the risk out of it for politicians, for civil servants, for consultants, for developers, indeed, and also starts to deal with community solution. And I'm just going to take a wee minute here to say the poll is direct. Let me see the tab and the Q&A on Sido to answer. So people, we sort of direct you to take part in a little poll in the last few minutes here. It's live. You can go to the poll tab and maybe answer those questions. That would be really helpful for us. And this is a series part of Communities in Transition, and that word transition is also really interesting. And transition cities, towns movement is that we can't make major shifts. We can't, you know, we need long-term plans. We need ways of getting to the long-term plans, but we need to realize that we're in a transition phase. We're always going to have to transition. And I think, I'm wondering, does anyone want to wrap up with kind of some good positive points there from many of the panel members as well? Very quickly, just a few words or sentences.
Mark, can I just say, I live in North Belfast as well as work in North Belfast. And as Mary was saying earlier on, there are so many good things about living in North Belfast. I'm not originally from here, but I've been living here for almost 30 years. All my kids have been brought up here. And North Belfast, despite the fact that it gets a bad rep, you know, in other places, North Belfast is a great, and really what makes North Belfast are the people in North Belfast. You have like the hills, you have the river, but essentially what makes North Belfast is that there's a very close, not close knit, but people talk to you. You know, so there's a lot that can be built on down there. And in terms of people were saying earlier on about master plans, you know, the master plan that we're looking down at here, the Clarendon Sailortown master plan, to see the way we kept the Sailortown name in it. But basically the master plan that we're looking at down here, from my understanding, it takes anything from 10 to 15 years for them to come in. In the shorter term, there are things that can be done, quick wins that can be done. And I think those are the kind of things that need to come in order to give local people a wee bit of a lift and make them feel as if something is happening. But like I say, there's a lot of positive things about North Belfast, which I think can be built on.
Wow.
Okay, any closing comments from yourself, Tony? Do you want to?
Well, I just say that in the UK or in London, there are practices like MAF that do considerable amounts of work in the public realm through discussion. So there's expertise across the UK, which struggles in a way to, it manages to do things, but it can't do things comprehensively. So what I'm hearing is that there's an absolute abundance of talent and experience, but what is necessary is some means whereby it can produce the result that you want, which is that area of North Belfast becoming habitable again. And that seems to me to be the question that I don't see an answer to. That's maybe because I don't know your area well enough, but implementation is the big issue here. So there's all the resources you need in terms of people and views, but the question is how can you get it done?
I think all of us here locally know that a big decision hinges on on unlocking the interchange first, but that's only
Yep.
the start of a longer term process.
Mm.
Michael, do you want to say a final sentence or two?
Well, I mean, I'm just going to repeat Tony's point. I mean, I do feel there's such a strong consensus about the, if you like, the shape of a solution for something like this, and it's co-design. It's also things that none of us are arguing about anymore. You know, that it is better to walk rather than drive your car and park downtown. So all those things that we all take for granted, and it is just just how these things link together. And I'm still scratching my head always about how big decisions are made, and then be it, say, the University of Ulster, that development, and something else down the road, and there isn't a forum. There hasn't been a forum where all those bits are put on the same drawing, and somebody says, you know what, we're going to do this for the university, and we're going to do this for an interchange. Don't we all need to be in the same room and make sure?
And then maybe, and I think really, I'll come to you, Ken, briefly, but I think that's really pointing to what Mary's saying about Healthy North Belfast as an existing forum that seems to be positive and drawing on a wider audience. If we brought a physical and planning aspects somehow into that would be a useful mechanism. Ken, do you want to make a final?
Yeah, well, we were making that point, I don't know, a decade ago about all the things that were happening, and there was no overview.
Yep.
There was no sense of looking at how one development affected another, or how it affected the local neighbourhood. And we saw it as a missed opportunity to actually look for, what's that awful word they used to use in the EU, you bring things together with the outcome is better than the sum of the parts. I can't remember the word, but anyway.
Mm-hmm.
The point is that we were always arguing for that, and yet we didn't have that sort of. But can I say one last thing, Mark, before we finish? And that is, it's really to everyone else to recognize the resource that you have here in Mark, because, you know, he has brought to the table here an analysis of the situation in our North Belfast that strays across all sorts of disciplinary boundaries here: architecture, urban design, planning, and almost critically engineering as well, to understand the engineers. And when we were taking on the engineers way back, and Mark still is, you know, I think they were quite astounded by his knowledge and his ability to challenge some of the things that we're saying. So it is an incredible resource we have in inner North Belfast in the form of Mark's contributions. So we should value that and see how we can take it forward.
Hear, 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 hear. And I'll just add one thing, which is a point that Mark himself has already highlighted to what we've been discussing, which has been a really fascinating debate. It is the opportunity because it's publicly owned land, but therefore it is within our gift, if there is enough creativity and enough imagination, to actually do something quite meaningful. And yes, it does need to be part of a bigger piece, but even on that one piece, we actually could begin something very, very important.
Yeah. Okay, great. Look, I'd really love to thank you all for your contributions. Any other comment there coming through? You can say something, Tony? Or
well, I think the point that I think Terry made about small wins, immediate wins, absolutely essential, because you're right, the master plans are kind of ghost shadow over a project for too long, because it does take a long time. So immediate wins, they're really valuable.
Okay, well, look, I think we should probably wrap up. We're 2 minutes to 4, and I think, can I still ask everybody who hasn't taken part of the poll? I don't know if our panel here can take part of the poll, but it's somewhere on poll tab beside the Q&A in your silo. I'm sort of struggling to handle all the technology myself. So thank everybody for the contribution. Thanks to Communities in Transition, to the Executive Office for this process that we've been running in North Belfast, and great thanks to all the panel members. I think it's been a really kind of great, diverse conversation to see you all here, and I think that's it from me. Let me see. Okay, I'm just reading something here. Okay, that's great. Thank you everybody for taking part, and this will be recorded and online, and there is another 3 events coming. There's one on Great Places North Belfast, which delves into detail. The Garden Grid, which is a more viral approach to dealing within neighbourhoods. And then there's a kind of keynote as well on, in 3 days' time, talking about health change. Mary, maybe you'd want to talk a little bit about that briefly, introduce that final health seminar.
Sorry, Mark, the final health seminar on Thursday.
Yes, you might want to say a quick word about that, would you know?
I'm not actually involved in that, Mark.
Right, okay.
It's about behaviour change, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it's about behaviour change. And I think these are kind of delving into other areas of health and well-being. So there's a whole series coming. This is the first, and thank everybody for coming along. And thank you all for the technology people behind the scenes making this all work. Okay, so from North Belfast to the world, because I know there's people from all around the world, we're going to say goodbye.
Thanks very much,
Thanks, Mark. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.